Hey, here we go. Hi, everybody. Aloha, kako. My name is Cindy Franklin. I teach at the University of Hawaii, and I'm very happy to be interviewing Noura Erakat today. Noura has been someone I've worked with in some capacity or other since 2013. And I'll just introduce her briefly to you because I'm going to have her introduce herself as well. Noura is a human rights attorney and assistant professor at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. She has served as legal counsel to the U.S. House of Representatives and as a legal advocate for Palestinian refugee rights at the United Nations. Her research interests include human rights and humanitarian, refugee, and national security law, and she is a frequent commentator and a fiery and brilliant one with recent appearances on CBS News, CNN, Fox News, breaking the adage that the more you watch, the less you know, and NPR, among others. Her writings have been widely published in national media and academic journals, and she is the author of Justice for Some, Law and the Question of Palestine, Stanford University Press, 2019. It is such a pleasure to have you. And what's not in that introduction that I want to mention is that you are, a kind of ally extraordinaire. So we're very happy to have you as part of this Mauna Kea syllabus project in our allies section. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to you, and I'm going to ask you if you can begin by just telling us a little bit about your family and where you are from, just to kind of help orient us that way.
Sure. So I just want to say what an honor it is to be an ally in the fight for the Mauna Kea, but more broadly, the fight for Hawaiian liberation, and to be in struggle with you. So thank you so much for having me, for welcoming me into that space and letting me grow and learn along with you. I am Palestinian. I am the daughter of first generation Palestinian immigrants to the United States who are both from Abu Dis, which is an East Jerusalem suburb. And my family was not affected by the 1948 war in the sense that they did not become refugees then, but they were directly impacted in 1967 by that war. We become what's part of the West Bank, which is then further inscribed with different colonial borders and juridical markers over time through military law, as well as through the Oslo peace process framework. I grew up on occupied Ohlone lands in Western United States, and I'm now at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, on Piscataway lands.
Thank you, Noura. And in terms of this interview, in this section on allies, I'm just wondering how you would like to be identified, what you call yourself in relationship with the movement for Mauna Kea. How would you talk about that?
So it's interesting because I think as a Palestinian in the United States, the way that I've identified is as by structure. I'm a settler by structure. Even though, I know that there is in the academic literature on this a lot of debate on what it means. Can you be a settler without the intent to settle, to stay, and to replace? Or are we therefore just arrivants? I tend to choose the moniker settler in order to basically acknowledge the structure under which we live, and the structure of settler colonialism, and how my presence, willingly or not, can be furthered, can further native elimination. So I say that to preface. So then what is my relationship to Hawaii, which we understand is part of the United States, but is obviously occupied territory. And so there, sometimes I identify with it in two ways. One way is to be challenging U.S. empire from within, and about what the United States wants to use, wants to expand in its name. And here we're talking about those, more land, Hawaiian land and Hawaiian territory to use as a military base. The other way I identify with it is as a Palestinian. and as a Palestinian, also directly combating US imperialism and its support for Israel, which entrenches my exclusion from home as a Palestinian, challenges my narratives of belonging and of history, and challenges my ability to be part of the future of Palestine. And so in that way, I'm both an ally in trying to challenge US settler colonialism from within, as well as as someone in the United States, but also an ally as a Palestinian, challenging U.S. imperialism and its direct violence upon our bodies and our families and our futures.
Thank you, Noura. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your time in Hawaii, including the most recent time when, the struggle for Mauna Kea was going in full force, and just what you took away from that, how you connected to that. If you want to comment at all on the concepts of Aloha Aina or Kapu Aloha in relation to how those principles ground you or don't in relation to the struggle for justice in Palestine, how they differ, how they articulate or don't. Any of that you'd like to comment on would be great. I realize that's a very broad question.
No, and I appreciate the broadness of it. I mean, and I've been really honest about this from the first trip. So, Cindy, we should tell the audience, you invite me for the first time to Hawaii in 2014.
Yeah.
Which is after the third large-scale offensive against the Gaza Strip. I mean, we're talking about the only nuclear power in the Middle East, the 11th most significant military power in the world, using advanced weapons technologies to pummel a besieged population with the consent of the world, where the destruction and the violence that the Palestinians trapped in Gaza are enduring. And I say trapped literally, because the borders were sealed. They could not even escape to become refugees of war. And as they're enduring this bombardment, they were also blamed for their own register of death and destruction that was being inflicted by the US's primary ally in the Middle East. So, Cindy, you invite me in the aftermath of this to discuss, how do we understand these wars on Gaza that we're being told are part of a national security framework in order to protect the United States, from the onslaught of, Muslim terrorists, and Israel happens to be the westernmost defensive front against that onslaught. So this is the national security narrative that's ingrained. And we understand it through a national security framework as opposed to a human rights one, a humanitarian one, certainly not an indigenous one, right? And so I was honored to come. Can I answer my daughter's call? This can be
Please
edited.
do.
Right?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Nam Naya. Yes, mommy.
Can you come to the pumpkin patch with us?
Sure. Can you not call me unless it's really, really important, Mama? I'm on a work call. Naya, can you hear me? Over.
Yes, I can. I'm at their house. Just stop talking. I got it. Over.
Okay. I got it.
Stop talking. I got it. Over.
I think that we should leave this in because it would be the most entertaining part of.
You should definitely leave it in. I think like what you're saying in this whole dimension of like, I can't begin to describe to people. It's not just like the administrative work of like making sure Naya finishes school in a day. It's like this, right?
Yeah,
like,
of course.
there's no, you're constantly entwined. Okay. So we built up to this moment of, I come to Hawaii. I certainly understand that I'm coming to a political place. I had been reading, I was in community with Keolani Ka'uanui, and she had sent me some of her primary articles. So I'd begun to understand that there was a framework of, the restoration of the national kingdom versus an indigenous framework. And so I understood that there was struggle. But I didn't know the texture of it. I definitely didn't I'd never been as an adult and in a political context in what would be a solidarity trip. And I was not prepared at all for the feeling that I would have of coming to a place where the relationship to the land was so fundamental that this wasn't, I got there thinking that I would understand that this would be a cerebral connection, right? And in so many ways, Palestine is split in this way too, whereas many people want to understand it as a cerebral concept, right? It's at the United Nations, there's certain international law paradigms. You cannot be prepared for the energy of the earth itself, of the land itself, of the people themselves, and how they frame it, and what was meant, what was going on in terms of, forms of indigenous resurgence, of traveling to, the farms that we traveled to, and understanding what it meant there, learning what access to water meant, what it meant to cultivate taro, what it meant to resuscitate and to teach a native Hawaiian language, right? What it meant to be engaged in cultural song, music, and dance. That all of those things were about resistance, and what I come to name later only as indigenous resurgence. Mm-hmm. And it was an overwhelming feeling, Cindy, that left me really shaken in a good way, but oftentimes on most of my days, like now, just very emotional, mm-hmm. filled with the kind of like this metaphysical commitment to something that our writing and our reading could not possibly convey. And that's when I first learned of the concept of aloha ina, and what that relationship meant. It then challenged me to think about what how a little bit of what this meant in Palestine, but not as much as when I came back this last time in November 2019. In November 2019, those terms had crystallized more in terms of indigenous resurgence, my own analysis about Palestinian indigeneity had both deepened significantly, but had been troubled significantly, through experiences and also through, scholarly inquiry. And so when I came back this time, now the conversations were heightened on a different level of understanding, of seeing the battle for the Mauna, such a pitched battle where the terms were very clear about sacred sites, about the debates between, of framing native life as a form of primordial kind of premodernity, and that science is the equivalent to advancement, and any future, all of those things were made so clear. And what was also made clear were what resistance and victory would look like. Like, I think, even though I did not have the opportunity to make it to the Mauna, despite my, efforts, I was with my daughter. It was really difficult, and my time was short. But what I understood is that on the Mauna itself, what was being created was the alternative future. It was a space of mutual aid and mutual existence. It was an alternative economy. It was an alternative governance structure. It was an alternative decision-making structure. All those things that we talk about what it would mean to overcome capitalism and overcome, settler sovereignty seem to be at play. If not, this is what it is, it was certainly, this is what it could be, and this is what it might take.
Thanks, Noura. That was really beautiful. So I want to ask you another question, and that has to do with stories, and just what kind of stories do you think you can and should be telling about your involvement in the movement for Mauna Kea, or other kind of work? And here I'll mention how much I enjoyed seeing the webinar that you participated in with Joy Hanamoto. And who else was in that one? Was that
Nick Estes was in it?
Nick Estes, and was Michael
and
Bennett
then
in
obviously,
that one?
And Michael and Michael Bennett were both in it.
Right. That was really the kind of work that you do, which is bringing together different movements and different struggles. And after your 2014 trip, you wrote an article about your time in Hawaii. And I know that when you do these things, you do them in a very purposeful kind of way. So I wondered if you could just say a bit about how you talk about Hawaii, the stories that you tell and the different contexts in which you tell those, just the kind of work that storytelling can and might
Yeah,
do.
absolutely. So I do want to say that, you know, when you first asked me, how am I an ally? I had to question, am I really an ally? Because not that I'm not in allyship, but because I didn't make it to the Mauna, because I didn't, you know, spend time, because I didn't put my body on the line, my first reaction is, no, I didn't do anything. Right. And so it's actually really helpful to hear you say these other things that are demonstrable and are advancing this work in alternative ways. And I think I say that out loud for other people who tend to also diminish their own contribution as well, that not all of us are always, you know, can always put our bodies on the line, not least because of distance. And yet we are in joint struggle. Right. And so thank you for reminding me, and then helping me to think about what that means. I definitely, you know, when I came back from the first trip in 2014, I actually did radio interviews. In addition to the article, I immediately incorporated Hawaii into all my syllabi in classrooms and made sure that I taught it. But what I was really trying to do is to use it in order to speak out, basically to expand to audiences who already understood Palestine, and to use that as a framework to understand Hawaii. And then also to expand into audiences that just understood certain themes on settler colonialism, military occupation, to, you know, to explain just Hawaii on its own. And the stories that I told always begin with that relationship to the land, and not necessarily with, you know, the Marine, U.S. Marines holding the Queen hostage in the, you know, Royal Palace, which is, I think, you know, another way to begin the story, but instead begins with, there's land, and there's a people on this land that have a relationship to it with an entirely different cosmology than the one that we've been taught to accept as a universal one and an inevitable one, right? And so I begin with the story of that, the reaction, and the concept of aloha ina, to begin to tell that story. And then, you know, since then, as this conversation has gotten incredibly complicated, you know, it's gotten complicated, as I mentioned, as I think about indigeneity in Palestine, because it puts to question so much of the international law definition of indigenous peoples is directly connected and tied to peoples who we consider First Nations, who do have an understanding of the universe that's tied to their relationship to the land, not just a special relationship to the land. And that definition can exclude Palestinians who who definitely have a relationship to the land, but see themselves as part of a broader Arab world and a different cosmology, right? Who have, you know, religious practices are predominantly Muslim and Christian, Jewish and atheist, right? Even though it's not necessarily the same. It precedes colonial conquest, but is complicated. So I've learned to use that complication rather than to come down and have, you know, one definition or another. Instead, to think, how does the Palestinian case study actually change our theories of indigeneity and how we should think about it? And how do our present day understandings of indigeneity help us rethink Palestine, right? And in the same way, and this comes back to joy, how did the Black Lives Matter movement force us, you know, compel us to think about, what does anti-Blackness have to do with our present? And what does it tell us about what our resistance should look like and how we should fight and what the future should look like, right? So in the same way that these terms are complicated, it's not like these single terms where everybody on one side is good. It's within our movements are many, many different types of, you know, fissures that are created in the same way that I'm a settler in the United States and a Palestinian in exile, an indigenous Palestinian in exile, right? And white adjacent, but also brown. So I try, I don't have answers, but I do know that we have analyses that we've developed that bring us in community, and the work with Joy and Nick and Michael and Pele was one example of that, of what are the opportunities that we have to bridge those conversations, and we can and we should. And so that's what I've tried to do with the platforms that I have. And certainly, the work that most professors, the unseen work, the labor of most educators in our classrooms. It's happening in our class. It's happening on my curricula. It's happening in the classroom. And as much as possible, I try to take it also to a more public space.
Thank you, Noura. And you raised so many issues in there. The question of indigeneity, I know, is one of heated debate and multiple viewpoints among Palestinians, between Palestinians and Hawaiians, and various other indigenous groups. So I really want to note my appreciation for you raising these topics for people who are watching this to think about and read more about and debate about.
Can I add something to this?
Sure, of course.
So I was in Hawaii with somebody that we both love, Tare Radi. And I remember at your home, I had this conversation with John Osorio and thinking about, how beautiful it was that we were at the hula in the morning, what the hula meant. And it just makes you so enraged to think about the commodification of hula and the dance, which is this commitment. It's like the depke, right? Everything. It's this commitment to the land. It's like even the dance is land based. It's a reaffirmation of sociality and community, and the music. And so I was just in awe. And I was telling John about the hula that morning and protocol, and what I wish, thinking about what I wish for Palestinians, like what it would mean for us to have protocol, and that we had not articulated that. And John explained, he was like, it's not as if Hawaiians, and more specifically the Kanaka Maoli, knew what this was the whole time and just had to redo it. It had to be learned. It was a process. It revealed itself to the people. And so that was helpful for me to think about, that there was still so much to be revealed about what we don't know about Palestine. And the reason I mentioned Tare is because Tare in his PhD, program right now in his doctoral studies is studying precisely that. He has emphasized to me that what we know so much about Palestine is a history of the elite, of the Palestinian elite. There is a peasant history, right, that we do not know in the same kind of detail and has not been narrated in the same way. And there are things still to be revealed. And I find glimmers of that everywhere now, in my own travels and studies. I mean, besides, the depke and the music and the tatriz, the cross stitch and the dress, but also, there's a woman, a sister, comrade of mine, Vivian Sansour, who has started a seed library in I think it's Sahur or Bet Jala, let's just say outside of Bethlehem. And what she's doing is she's preserving an entirely, a history of our relationship to the land, of our land-based relationship, of our medicines, of foods, of how we sustained ourselves in that environment. And so it just, it's more of the affirmation of there's so much more that we do not know rather than what we do know. And that's, it's the synergy. Mm-hmm. It's the synergy. That's the transnationalism for me. That's just so communicative and instructional.
Thank you. That's amazing. I mean, I'm just also thinking about how many of these protocols are drawing on past, but they're inventing the future that people want. They're not just recovering past knowledges, right? They're activating them and creating and bringing new ways of being into existence.
Absolutely.
So I think you've answered the question I wanted to close out with, which was just the kind of decolonial future that you can see for places like Hawaii and Palestine, how people can work together. I think you actually addressed that in your last answer to me. So in closing, I just want to ask you, is there anything you would like to say or share that you haven't had a chance to over the course of these last few minutes that we've been talking? Anything you want to leave us with?
You know, the only thing is, I think for me, mostly, it's just to emphasize just the humility. I can't praise my own humility. That's not what I mean, but just like, it's overwhelming, right? It's overwhelming to be in solidarity and community together. It's so powerful. And I'm really grateful to be part of community and to continue to build. One of the, I think the reason for me visiting Hawaii in 2019, it was part of an academic conference, but it was so much deeper for me because I felt like I was coming home to a community of comrades and friends. I really did feel like there was an alternative place there. And I want to continue to build that and to grow that and hopefully serve as some sort of a bridge and an interlocutor to others who want to do the same. I know I'm not alone in terms of, besides Yusuf al-Jamal and Noura Erakat and Nadira Shalhoub Kevorkian and other, Palestinians who have been there and who are there, right? Rami Kanazi, and others who have been there, but also, like Nadia Tannous, and so on and so forth. But there's still, still yet more communities. Part of the challenges of building transnational solidarity for Palestinians is the limitation of movement for Palestinians, right? So often, and I said this on the first trip, I become the Palestinian interlocutor in Hawaii, except I come from North America.
Mm-hmm.
I traveled from North America and not directly from the Middle East, and that's also part of our condition. And so
Mm-hmm.
I'm just hoping that in the work that we do that it just gets, that it grows, and it grows in resistance, and it grows in celebration.
Well, I want to thank you and just say that your time here has helped that rippling, that growth. I know people here have, so much affection and take so much inspiration from you. So thank you for contributing yet another another little ripple to this.
I
this
can't wait
movement.
to come back. I can't wait to host some folks. I can't wait to travel together. We haven't done that. We haven't done a Hawaiian delegation to Palestine.
Post-COVID, it's in the future. Okay. Thank you so much, Noura. And really appreciate your contribution to this project.
Thank you, Cindy. Love seeing you as always.
Okay, I'm going to end the recording.